Do you know that one of history's most famous women wasn't actually Egyptian? That the seductress of legend was actually a brilliant diplomat who spoke 9 languages? And that her iconic death by snakebite probably never happened the way we imagine it? Today, we're diving into the real story of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, a woman who nearly changed the course of Western civilization, and one of the most misunderstood figures in all of history. For over 2,000 years, Cleopatra has been portrayed as a temptress who used her beauty to seduce powerful men. But the truth is far more interesting than the myth. She was a skilled politician, a naval commander, a patron of science, and a ruler who fought desperately to preserve her kingdom's independence in an era when Rome was swallowing the world. Now let's separate fact from fiction and discover who Cleopatra really was. Here's the first unusual fact that surprises most people. Cleopatra wasn't ethnically Egyptian. She was Greek, specifically Macedonian Greek. Her family, the Ptolemies, had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, but they were foreign rulers who had never fully assimilated into Egyptian culture. The Ptolemaic dynasty began with Ptolemy the Fern Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals. When Alexander died in 323 BCE and his empire fractured, Ptolemy grabbed Egypt and declared himself pharaoh. He founded Alexandria, which became the greatest center of learning in the ancient world, home to the famous library and museum. Now here's where it gets weird. The Ptolemies practiced brother-sister marriage to keep power within the family and to emulate the Egyptian pharaohs who had done the same. This wasn't occasional, it was standard practice for nearly every generation. Cleopatra herself was married to both of her younger brothers at different times, though these were political marriages, not romantic ones. This inbreeding should have been catastrophic, and in many ways it was. The later Ptolemies were notorious for being weak, corrupt, and incompetent. But here's the unusual fact. Cleopatra was different. Where her predecessors had been content to rule from the Greek quarter of Alexandria and ignore Egyptian culture, Cleopatra actually learned Egyptian. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years to speak the native language of her subject. This wasn't just symbolic. By speaking Egyptian, Cleopatra could communicate directly with her subjects, participate in Egyptian religious ceremonies, and present herself as a true pharaoh rather than just another Greek overlord. Ancient sources tell us she spoke at least 9 languages: Egyptian, Greek, Aramaic, Hebrew, Syriac, Median, Parthian, Latin, and possibly others. This linguistic ability was a superpower in the multilingual ancient world. Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE, the daughter of Ptolemy XIII Auletes, the flute player. Her father was a weak ruler who had bought his throne by bribing Roman politicians and who was overthrown multiple times by his own people. Young Cleopatra watched as her father groveled before Rome, selling Egypt's independence piece by piece just to stay in power. She learned crucial lessons from his failures. Rome was the dominant power and couldn't be ignored, but it could be manipulated. Roman politicians were corruptible, and most importantly, Egypt's best chance for survival was to find powerful Roman allies who could protect it from other Romans. When Ptolemy XIII died in 51 BCE, 18-year-old Cleopatra became co-ruler with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy III. According to Egyptian tradition and their father's will, they were also married, though again this was purely political. Almost immediately tensions erupted. Cleopatra was intelligent, ambitious, and capable. Her brother's advisors, the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achilles, and the rhetoric teacher Theodotus, wanted real power, not a strong queen. Within 3 years, they had maneuvered Cleopatra into exile. This is where most people think the story begins, with Cleopatra's famous meeting with Julius Caesar. But here's what you need to understand. When Cleopatra was forced out of Alexandria in 48 BCE, she didn't give up. She raised an army on Egypt's eastern frontier and prepared to take back her throne by force. And then, unexpectedly, the most powerful man in the world, arrived in Alexandria, and Cleopatra saw her opportunity. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria pursuing his rival Pompey in Rome's civil war. Pompey had been Caesar's son-in-law and partner in the first triumvirate, but their alliance had collapsed into war. Pompey fled to Egypt seeking refuge, and Ptolemy III's advisors made a catastrophic calculation. They assassinated Pompey and presented his severed head to Caesar as a gift, thinking they'd win Caesar's favor. Instead, Caesar was horrified. Pompey had been a Roman consul, and killing him dishonored Rome. Some sources say Caesar actually wept when he saw Pompey's head. Whether that's true or propaganda, the message was clear. Young Ptolemy's advisors had miscalculated badly. Caesar declared that as a Roman consul, he would arbitrate the dispute between Cleopatra and her brother. Both were summoned to appear before him. Now we come to one of the most famous scenes in all of ancient history. Cleopatra smuggled into the palace wrapped in a carpet, or according to some sources, in a large sack used for bedding. This actually happened, though it wasn't romantic. It was desperate and dangerous. Here's the unusual fact. Cleopatra wasn't sneaking in to seduce Caesar with her beauty. She was sneaking in because her brother's guards controlled Alexandria and would have killed her if she'd entered openly. The carpet trick was a practical solution to a security problem. Once inside, she presented her case to Caesar, and yes, they became lovers. But let's be clear about what this relationship actually was: a political alliance sealed with romance. Cleopatra needed Roman military support to defeat her brother. Caesar, at 52, needed Egyptian grain to feed Rome's population and Egyptian wealth to fund his political ambitions. He also needed a stable ally controlling Egypt. What did Cleopatra offer Caesar that made her so valuable? Here's what most people miss. She wasn't just offering her body, she was offering her brain. Caesar was one of the most intelligent men of his generation, and sources suggest he was genuinely impressed by Cleopatra's intellect. Plutarch writes that her beauty was not in itself absolutely without parallel, but that the charm of her presence was irresistible, and the character that attended all she said or did was something bewitching. Translation: she was smart, charming, and knew how to talk to powerful men as equals. In an era when most women had no political voice, this was extraordinary. Caesar sided with Cleopatra. The result was the Alexandrine War. Ptolemy III's forces besieged Caesar and Cleopatra in the palace quarter. During this siege, something tragic happened. Fire broke out and spread to the famous Library of Alexandria, destroying part of its collection. The exact extent of the damage is debated, but it was significant. The greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world, damaged because of a power struggle. Caesar won the war. Ptolemy III drowned in the Nile fleeing the battlefield. Cleopatra was restored as queen, now married to her youngest brother, Ptolemy XIV, who was about 12 years old and firmly under her control. She was the undisputed ruler of Egypt. In 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to a son she named Ptolemy Caesar, called Caesarion, Little Caesar. She claimed Caesar was the father. He never officially acknowledged paternity, but he didn't deny it either, and he allowed the boy to use his name. Now here's where that astronomy book becomes relevant. During Cleopatra's time, the Museum of Alexandria was home to some of the greatest astronomers in the ancient world. They were refining the astronomical observations of Hipparchus, developing improved models of planetary motion, and working on calendar reform. Caesar was so impressed by Egyptian astronomical knowledge that he brought the mathematician Sosigenes back to Rome to help reform the Roman calendar, creating what we know as the Julian calendar. James Evans's The History and Practice of Ancient Astronomy provides fascinating details about how these Egyptian astronomers made their calculations and how their work influenced the calendar we still use today. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra visited Rome, an extraordinary journey for an Egyptian queen. She stayed in Caesar's villa across the Tiber. Romans were scandalized. Here was Caesar, flaunting his foreign mistress while his wife Calpurnia remained in their house. Cleopatra commissioned a golden statue of herself as the goddess Isis to be placed in the temple of Venus Genetrix, Caesar's ancestral deity. She was inserting herself into the religious and political heart of Rome. For 18 months, Cleopatra lived in Rome, networking with Roman elites, observing Roman politics, and positioning herself and Egypt as essential to Rome's future. She met Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted lieutenant. She watched as Caesar accumulated more and more power, moving toward kingship in all but name. And then, on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, everything changed. Caesar was assassinated by senators who feared he would make himself king. Cleopatra was in Rome when it happened. She fled immediately back to Egypt, realizing that without Caesar's protection, she and her son were in danger. Shortly after her return, her co-ruler brother Ptolemy XIV mysteriously died, almost certainly poisoned on her orders. She made 3-year-old Caesarion her co-ruler. She now ruled alone with her son as the heir who connected her to Caesar's legacy. The Roman world descended into chaos. Caesar's assassins fled east. Caesar's allies, Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Caesar's adopted heir Octavian, formed the second triumvirate and hunted down the assassins. After their victory at Philippi in 42 BCE, the triumvirate divided the Roman world. Octavian took the west, Antony took the east, and Lepidus got Africa. For Cleopatra, this meant a new reality. The most powerful man in her part of the world was now Mark Antony, and Antony wanted to meet her. In 41 BCE, Mark Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus, in modern Turkey. He needed Egyptian support for a planned war against Parthia, and he wanted to know where Cleopatra's loyalties had been during Rome's civil war. Cleopatra understood this meeting would determine Egypt's future, so she staged one of the most spectacular displays in ancient history. She sailed up the Cydnus River in a magnificent barge with purple sails, silver oars, and gilded stern. She reclined under a canopy dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love, while boys dressed as Cupids fanned her. The oars kept time to flute music. Perfumed smoke wafted from the ship. Crowds lined the riverbanks to watch. This wasn't vanity, it was political theater. Cleopatra was demonstrating Egypt's wealth, power, and cultural sophistication. She was telling Antony, "I'm not some client queen you can order around. I'm a goddess queen who rules the richest kingdom in your half of the world. Let's talk as equals." It worked. According to Plutarch, Antony was captivated. They became lovers, but once again, let's understand what this relationship actually was: a strategic partnership. Antony was 42, a skilled general and politician, but he was also impulsive and pleasure-loving. Cleopatra was 28, at the height of her powers, and she knew exactly what she was doing. She gave Antony the support he needed for his eastern campaigns. In return, he gave her back territories that had once belonged to Egypt, parts of Syria, Lebanon, Cyprus, and Crete. Here's the unusual fact that changes the whole story. For several years after Tarsus, Antony and Cleopatra barely saw each other. Antony returned to Rome, married Octavian's sister Octavia in a political marriage, and spent 3 years in Athens with his new wife. Cleopatra, meanwhile, gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and ruled Egypt alone. The relationship wasn't some torrid love affair from the start. It was an on-again, off-again political alliance that happened to include romance. Antony's Parthian campaign in 36 BCE was a disaster. He lost a third of his army and barely escaped with his life. Humiliated, he returned not to his Roman wife Octavia, but to Cleopatra in Alexandria. Now the relationship deepened and became more committed, perhaps because Antony needed Cleopatra's unwavering support after his failure. In 34 BCE, after a successful campaign in Armenia, Antony held a triumph, not in Rome, as tradition demanded, but in Alexandria. He staged what became known as the Donations of Alexandria, a ceremony where he distributed eastern territories among Cleopatra's children. Caesarion was declared King of Kings and rightful heir of Julius Caesar. The twins and their younger brother Ptolemy Philadelphus were made rulers of various eastern territories. Antony declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings and sat beside her dressed in Greek clothing while she wore Egyptian royal regalia. To Romans, this was shocking. A Roman triumvir subordinating himself to a foreign queen and declaring Caesar's alleged son his legitimate heir. Octavian, back in Rome, couldn't have asked for better propaganda. He portrayed Antony as a man who had gone native, who had been seduced by an Oriental queen into abandoning Rome. He claimed Cleopatra planned to rule the Roman Empire from Alexandria, to make Rome bow to Egypt. Was any of this true? Probably not entirely. Antony and Cleopatra were trying to create a new power structure, a Roman-Egyptian alliance that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean. But Octavian controlled the narrative in Rome, and narrative matters. In 32 BCE, Antony formally divorced Octavia. Octavian responded by declaring war, but cleverly, he didn't declare war on Antony, a Roman citizen. He declared war on Cleopatra, a foreign queen. This framed the conflict as Rome against Egypt, not Roman against Roman. The showdown came at Actium in 31 BCE, a naval battle off the coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a fleet of about 500 ships, facing Octavian's roughly 400 ships under his Admiral Agrippa. Here's where we need to talk about one of history's most controversial moments, and here's the unusual fact. What happened at Actium isn't as clear-cut as history usually tells it. The traditional story is that the battle was going indecisively when Cleopatra suddenly panicked and fled with her 60 ships, and Antony, like a lovesick fool, abandoned his fleet to follow her, losing the battle and the war. But modern historians question this narrative. Some suggest Cleopatra's departure wasn't panic, but a planned breakout. She was carrying the war treasury, and if the battle went badly, they needed those resources to continue fighting. Antony's decision to follow may have been strategic, not romantic, a commander choosing to preserve his resources for another day rather than fight a losing battle. We'll never know the truth. What we do know is the result. Antony's fleet surrendered shortly after. His land forces surrendered days later. The war was effectively over. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria. For months they waited as Octavian slowly advanced on Egypt, securing territories and accepting surrenders. They tried to negotiate. They sent messages offering to resign, to retire, to let their children rule. Octavian never responded directly. He just kept advancing. By July 30th BCE, Octavian's forces were outside Alexandria. Antony led a cavalry sortie that was briefly successful, but it was meaningless. The war was lost. Then came news that Cleopatra was dead, sealed in her tomb. Antony, devastated, fell on his sword, but he botched it. The wound was mortal, but not immediately fatal. Then came word that Cleopatra was actually alive. The report of her death had been a mistake or a miscommunication. Here's an unusual fact that adds tragedy to the story. Antony was carried to Cleopatra's mausoleum while dying. She had barricaded herself inside and wouldn't open the doors, either because she feared Roman soldiers or because the building's design prevented it. So Antony was hoisted up through a window. He died in Cleopatra's arms, surrounded by her attendants. One of the most powerful men in Rome, dying in a window because the door was locked. Cleopatra was now alone, 39 years old, her protector dead, her kingdom conquered. Octavian sent representatives demanding she surrender and come out of her mausoleum. She tried to negotiate for her children, particularly for Caesarion. Octavian had Caesarion hunted down and killed. His advisors told him, "Too many Caesars is not good," meaning that as long as Caesar's son lived, he was a threat to Octavian, Caesar's adopted son. On August 10th, 30 BCE, Cleopatra died. The official story, recorded by Octavian's historians, is that she committed suicide by allowing an asp, an Egyptian cobra, to bite her. This version became legend. Cleopatra, the Serpent Queen, dying by serpent, dramatic to the last. But here's the unusual fact. It probably didn't happen that way. Ancient sources disagree about how she died. Some say snakebite, some say poison, some say sharp implement. Plutarch, our most detailed source, admits he doesn't know. He says no one knows for certain. Modern scholars point out numerous problems with the ASP story. Cobras are large, aggressive, hard to control, and their venom causes a slow, agonizing death over hours or days, not the peaceful passing ancient sources describe. Would Cleopatra, who understood poisons, she had tested various poisons on prisoners to see which worked fastest, really choose such an unreliable method? More likely, she used poison, perhaps hidden in a hollow hairpin or jewelry, as some sources suggest. The asp story was probably Octavian's propaganda. It connected Cleopatra to Egyptian symbolism. The cobra was associated with Egyptian royalty and made her death seem exotic and Eastern, fitting his narrative of her as a dangerous foreign seductress. Cleopatra's children by Antony, the twins, and young Ptolemy were taken to Rome to march in Octavian's triumph, then were raised by Octavia, Antony's Roman widow. Cleopatra Selene eventually married King Juba II of Mauritania and became a queen herself. The boys disappear from history, likely killed or died young. Egypt became a Roman province. Its independence ended after 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization. Octavian took a new name, Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The Republic was dead. The empire was born. And Cleopatra became a legend, but a legend shaped by Roman propaganda, by men who had defeated her and wanted to justify her destruction. For 2,000 years, Cleopatra has been portrayed primarily through a male lens, particularly through Roman sources written by her enemies. They emphasized her sexuality because it was easier to claim she seduced powerful men than to admit she outmaneuvered them politically. Let's look at what we actually know about Cleopatra's capabilities. As an administrator, she ruled Egypt competently for 22 years. She managed the kingdom's grain production, the most crucial resource in the ancient world. She reformed currency, negotiated with local elites, and maintained complex religious institutions. There's evidence of only one major famine during her reign, which she handled by opening royal granaries. As a scholar, Cleopatra wrote treatises on cosmetics, medicine, and weights and measures. None survive, but ancient sources reference them. She patronized the Museum and Library of Alexandria. The astronomical work happening in Alexandria during her reign was remarkable. Scholars like Sosigenes were refining planetary models and improving calendar calculations. That astronomy book I mentioned, James Evans's The History and Practice of Ancient Astronomy, discusses how Alexandrian astronomy during this period influenced Roman calendar reform and astronomical understanding for centuries. As a linguist, speaking 9 languages wasn't just impressive, it was strategically crucial. She could negotiate directly with Aramaic-speaking Syrians, Hebrew-speaking Jews, Arabian traders, and Persian diplomats, without interpreters who might distort her words. As a naval commander, often forgotten is that Cleopatra personally commanded her squadron at Actium. Queens commanding fleets in battle was virtually unheard of. Whether her departure was panic or strategy, she was there, on the water, commanding ships. As a diplomat, she maintained Egypt's independence for 2 decades while every other Hellenistic kingdom fell to Rome. She did this through careful alliance building, knowing when to submit and when to push, understanding Roman politics better than most Romans. Here's an unusual fact about her appearance that surprises people. Cleopatra probably wasn't conventionally beautiful by ancient standards. Roman coins showing her profile reveal a large nose, prominent chin, and rather masculine features. This was intentional. Coins were political propaganda, and Cleopatra wanted to look strong and regal, not pretty. Her real power was intelligence, charisma, and presence. As Plutarch wrote, it wasn't her beauty that was remarkable, but the persuasiveness of her discourse and the character that attended all she said or did. She was also ruthless. She almost certainly poisoned her brother Ptolemy XV. She may have ordered other family members killed, though this was standard practice for Ptolemaic rulers. Ruthlessness wasn't a character flaw in ancient monarchs. It was a survival skill. What about her relationship with her children? The sources are mostly silent, but we know she fought desperately to secure their futures. She tried to send Caesarion to safety. He was caught. She negotiated with Octavian for her children by Antony. Her final requests were reportedly about ensuring their care. Whatever else she was a mother fighting for her children's survival. Modern historians have worked to recover the real Cleopatra from beneath layers of Roman propaganda, Shakespeare's poetry, and Hollywood's fantasies. What emerges is a complex figure, brilliant but ruthless, romantic but calculating, Egyptian but Greek, traditional but innovative. She represented the last great Hellenistic monarch, ruling at a time when that whole world was dying, when Rome was swallowing everything. She fought to preserve her kingdom's independence with every tool she had: military force, diplomacy, wealth, intelligence, and yes, strategic relationships with powerful men. She lost. Egypt became Roman, but she fought so well that 2,000 years later, we still know her name. Cleopatra has been called a seductress, a witch, a goddess, a monster, a romantic heroine, and a tragic figure. She's been painted by Michelangelo, dramatized by Shakespeare, and portrayed by Elizabeth Taylor. Her story has been told and retold countless times, each generation reimagining her for their own purposes. But perhaps the most interesting thing about Cleopatra is this: she was the last pharaoh of Egypt, the end of a civilization that had lasted 3,000 years. After her, there would never again be an independent Egypt ruled by pharaohs. The age of the god-kings was over. She knew this was coming. She watched the old world dying and tried desperately to save her piece of it. She understood that Rome was the future, so she tried to become part of that future on her own terms, as an ally rather than a subject. She almost succeeded. If Actium had gone differently, if Antony had defeated Octavian, we might live in a world where Egyptian and Roman culture merged, where Alexandria rivaled Rome, where Cleopatra's descendants ruled the Eastern Mediterranean. But history doesn't deal in almost. Cleopatra lost, and the winners wrote her story. They made her a cautionary tale about the dangers of foreign influence and female sexuality. They couldn't erase her completely, but they could distort her. The unusual fact is that she's still fascinating us 2 millennia later, not because of how she was portrayed, but because we sense there's a real, brilliant, complicated woman beneath the propaganda, and we keep trying to find her. If you enjoyed this deep dive into ancient biography and unusual historical facts, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We're exploring the fascinating lives of ancient and medieval figures whose true stories are even more interesting than the legends. And if you're curious about the scientific achievements of Cleopatra's Alexandria, seriously check out that astronomy book. The work happening in that city during her lifetime was absolutely cutting edge, and it shaped how we understand the cosmos even today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.